It was 1 a.m. on October the 4th, day one of the invasion. By this time, only 1 hour into the entire invasion, ample combat occurrences were unfolding all throughout the Houston battle in its main core metro area and even beyond to its immediate south and also to its immediate east and in the core metro area itself. As the first major action was to not only get the PLAN Marines ashore in Texas City, Texas, but also to destroy the nucleus, the nerve center, the ultimate command and control center over the entire city's defenses at the Ellington Joint Base, which encapsulated 5 of 6 of the American military branches. And although this was not an active duty installation, it was rapidly becoming the key command and control facility as well as the key logistical hub before the logistics would be sent out to the forward logistical areas, which were held by the support squadron of the 278th ACR and also its headquarters of headquarters troop, which was its command and additional logistical elements, both of which had set up forward logistical centers where logistics could be brought in by barge to the riverine port facilities in the Galena Park area, as well as also trucked in by the nearby road systems adjacent to the headquarters of headquarters troop, which also were conveniently adjacent to Ellington. And the rail system also played a role in getting units where they needed to go, which included some of the heavier units being brought in by train from the out-of-state elements that had been brought in to comprise the city's defense forces, which included its 3rd Squadron, its 2nd Squadron, also its 1st Squadron, its artillery forces, even including artillery off-map, which was the first of the 141st in League City, literally between the main core metro area and Texas City, Texas, which would be handled by the PLAN Marines after a savage Tu-22M strategic raid in League City would annihilate most of the 1st of the 141st, leaving scattered remnants that were barely out of the range of the drop munitions to have to fend for themselves, which would be cleaned up as some of the last actions of the entire battle by the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade before they would move into the core metro area itself. As for the time being, 1 hour in, there were so many occurrences unfolding throughout the entire area, including the enormous artillery barrage being carried out not just by the entire 83rd PLA Artillery Brigade of the 83rd Group Army, but also each and every artillery battalion and each and every combined arms brigade firing at their specific targets in support of their maneuver elements. However, against the American artillery forces, who now had to do gunnery the old school way without GPS and without modern communications and other technologies as they had been left in the dark, they would now have to calculate all the right powder, fuse, and shell combinations along with the angle and traverse of their howitzers to be able to fire even remotely accurately at their targets, which are now have been discovered by fleeing civilians, both refugees and armed reactionary type civilians that had fled the area after spotting PLA activity and failed attacks against some of these PLA forces that had begun to muster and assemble on their CCP properties and had been spotted doing so by these different civilian elements. As the PLA tended to avoid civilians that didn't pose a threat to them, they did, for a time, allow some of them to flee, but in doing so, they had informed the Americans roughly the positions where they had spotted PLA forces, and as a result, the Americans were very temporarily able for an extremely short time to get off some rounds. And while they fired at this battalion and wouldn't hit anything, as by the time they actually were able to fire at this battalion, it had moved and captured the West Houston airport in conjunction with this battalion, which had fended off these armed reactionary civilians with the assistance of combat drones and loitering munitions before itself moving also into the airport, with these other battalions assisting one another with also air support and fending off these attacks from armed reactionary civilians before they then broke into their comprising different companies and went to the CCP properties to man them as these forces left. and moving into the airport. With the PAP, when they would finish with the 3rd Squadron, would be moving in to be a heavier security force for these logistical, lighter, non-combat elements. And although they were non-combat troops, they were still fully capable of defending themselves, and they were well armed with crew-served weapons and small arms, and they could call upon air power for support from drones and aircraft. As these PAP forces were still fighting their battle in the northwest of the city against the heavy 3rd Squadron, as well as the combat going on against the logistical forces of the support squadron conducted by a mechanized infantry battalion from the 58th Combined Arms Brigade, with artillery support from the artillery battalion of the 58th and the artillery battalion from the 113th. The other combat unfolding included also combat against other forces from out of state, like the 2nd of the 156th from Louisiana's 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, and the 1st of the 141st was in League City off the map, getting heavily carpet munitioned by a Tu-22M with very few survivors that would be essentially mopped up by the PLAN Marines later in the battle, as they would move up after consolidating control over Texas City, Texas, as this battle would last for some hours, and it was still extremely early into it. As other fighting was going on, the massive amount of 122mm rocket fire, 155mm howitzer fire, and 300mm rocket fire into the northern and central parts of Houston were leaving the city in complete rubble desolation and destroying many lives with it, and would cause different reactionary forces and military forces to flee as a result of taking heavy damage. As the armored forces of the 131st had finished up with the 700 armed reactionary civilians, and this grouping just over 200, with this battalion surrounding and destroying them and clearing the southwestern flanks of the operation in the core metro area. They now converged together by 1 a.m., as this has been done rapidly with artillery support, all ISR-directed fighting, destroying all of these forces before moving in to finish off rapidly this artillery battalion, which this battle would move a lot faster than some of the other combat occurring, because in this battle, the airstrikes contributed would be massive, along with strafing attacks, also the addition of a DF-11A tactical ballistic missile strike, and all of the loitering munitions, combined with the extremely powerful ground forces, which their armored infantry possess, the vaunted VN-20s, with their very modern capabilities, as they were the newest generation of infantry fighting vehicle and potentially the most advanced in the world right now. And also their Type 99A main battle tanks, which had active protection from their trophy-like system. They had laser and IR scrambling, as did the Type 96B, but this tank had even better armor protection, and it had additional features that most other main battle tanks just did not possess, and by its technical specifications alone was quite possibly the most advanced main battle tank in the world. And that's based on its armor protection, its firepower, its engine, and its additional features and capabilities. And while the tank companies were equipped with these, and the tank battalions or the armored battalions of the heavy combined arms brigades, the other combined arms brigades were equipped with the Type 96B, which was also extremely advanced, but the 99A was a step up from that. And the QN-506 was an anti-tank vehicle of such a destructive nature. It was not only a bona fide tank buster and vehicle destroyer, but it was also the scourge of infantry forces, boasting its 6 25mm grenade launchers, its 20 70mm laser-guided rockets, which could penetrate quite a bit of building material and armor. They also had their dual-purpose anti-air and anti-tank missiles. They carried 4 of those, which had the capability of penetrating 1,000 millimeters of RHA, which was the measurement of armor protection, and 1,000 millimeters of RHA means it could destroy any vehicle on the battlefield with ease. It had a 3.7-mile range, and it was a 151 millimeter QN502C, the dual AT-ADA missile, or air defense artillery missile. They also had 4 S507 loitering munitions, and they could be guided by the gunner through a camera and remote control. They had a 30 millimeter autocannon, 7.62 millimeter by 54 millimeter coax machine gun, and of course their own quadcopter recon drone, like every other crew and squad in the PLA, and also even the Russian forces as well. As the forces here, the armored infantry, the anti-tank companies, and the tank companies, along with their headquarters and support companies of these comprising these battalions, were on the move. The 2 different battalions had fanned out and were now making sure the entire area was secure as they sent forces of theirs forward to conduct the operation against the American forces. As the armored infantry and armor would closely shadow one another and receive ample support from the anti-tank vehicles and loitering munitions that would fill the sky with their ISR assets, mapping the battlefield in real time, including from the lowest quadcopter level all the way to the high-altitude drones, all the way up to satellite, providing a complete, full overlay of the evolving, changing battlefield. Their Type 89A being their armored personnel carrier of choice, of course, with essentially being a mobile fire support platform or mobile machine gun nest with their very capable 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, with the armored infantry dismounts like other mechanized infantry equipped with their own tank busting capabilities with their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles and their Type 69 light anti-armor weapons, which were their Chinese rocket-propelled grenades, which were produced in such massive quantities over the decades that nearly every soldier and paramilitary soldier had access to them throughout the Chinese forces. As these forces all converged on the industrial park in the Sugarland area, where the heavier American forces had detrained from, the U.S. forces had essentially, due to the hits that the aircraft industry had taken in recent times due to the economic woes of the nation, which were now surviving on subsidies from the regime, and the airports were kept afloat by the same, the American troops of the Guard were just flown in to Ellington and then bussed along the interstates and highways, or the state highways, to their location, which was off I-69 in this industrial park. And they had detrained their equipment that arrived by train, as the facilities, the different industrial plants in this area, which included the Sistel Corporation, which actually had DoD contracts for computer hardware, the pharmaceutical plant, the QVU plant, and there was a chemical plant, an oil refinery, ITI manufacturing, which customized different materials, wood, plastic, metal, and Kelsey Engineering, and also Airbus had a presence in this area as well, among other companies. This was a large industrial area, as again, industries in Houston were fairly well spread out and throughout the city. And as the forces converged and spread out, 2 tank companies, 1 armored infantry company, and half of the combat forces from an anti-tank company, or two of its combat platoons out of its 5 total platoons, which included also its headquarters and logistical platoon, were participating in the attack, with the armored infantry forces in this area with 2 platoons here of vehicles and 1 platoon of vehicles here, with the dismounts moving up with the different tank platoons, as the 4 combat platoons of the tank platoon of the tank companies were 1 platoon here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here, made 1 tank company with its headquarters and logistical elements off map. There was another tank platoon here, 1 here, 1 here, and 1 here, which made a 2nd tank company out of the 4 that comprise the portion of a battalion with the tank companies, with the anti-tank and armored infantry and headquarters troops, of course, with the platoon of QN506s right here, and another platoon of QN-506s right here, spread out with these forces. And they, again, could fire from quite a distance with their loitering munitions and, of course, their dual-purpose QN-502C missiles, which were their tank-busting missiles, and they could use their laser-guided rockets if they could get a shot between buildings or into buildings if needed, or around their forces when it was safe to do so, as everything was ISR directed and combat data link and radio coordinated. And as these forces had their AI system doing the heavy lifting for them in the processing of all the data and helping them make flexible and rapid command decisions, as well as also guiding their array of loitering munitions as a volley of 48 had been fired by the drone section's TEL-like system from the headquarters battalion of the 131st Combined Arms Brigade, the assortment of different platforms striking these American forces, firing at their support and logistical elements, which could absolutely never be tolerated, would be massive as loitering munitions came in and circled the area seeking targets, as well as the J-10 fighters, some of which had already just dropped munitions in support of PAP forces and now would be strafing. Since they had no more air-to-ground munitions and strictly had air-to-air munitions, they would use their 23mm nose cannons to strafe American forces on the ground and support their troops in that way. As these 250-kilogram munitions, which were over 500 pounds but rounded to 500-pounders, were of the free-fall type, as they opted in some of these J-10s to just load them on special racks so they could carry more of them, they would do these dive attacks where they would dive toward their target, drop their munitions, and they would land precisely on target. And while they had the option of using laser-guided or GPS, or essentially Baidu-guided munitions, as Baidu is China's GPS, they would opt for the free-fall variety here and use them in dive attacks, which were also quite accurate and would spread over an area and pound the area with various munitions and destroy everything within range. There were a few technicals, which were armed reactionary civilian vehicles that were moving through the area to spread word to these forces, which had begun to set up a concertina wire fence around their bivouac site, which was a empty warehouse in this campus of this oil refinery right here, this being a chemical plant right here, with a rail system running through this entire area. This is a road running through here with a bridge and a road over the Buffalo Bayou, which bent and weaved through this part of the city, and another road that went through these plants right here, this industrial park, and a dead-end road that went up here with gates that led into these different plants. But the fencing had all been but destroyed by this point, so now these different parking areas in the chemical plant and the other manufacturing plants in these areas were basically where the tents had been set up and the gun lines had been established along these tracks right here. And the day before, they had detrained some of their vehicles, their M109A6 Paladins, their FASVs, as each American howitzer gun section had a FASV and a howitzer, which the FASV carried the extra shells, primers, fuses, and powders, and other artillery supplies and tents and everything else. They detrained all these vehicles and their FDC vehicles, which were the high-top version of the M113s, and the Humvees they had for their command vehicles, for their battery commanders, and also their MRAPs, their Max Pro MRAPs, their M88 armored recovery vehicles, their fuel trucks, recovery vehicle right here, fuel truck, their LMTVs and HETs, which were their heavy equipment transporter trucks, and this was their headquarters company or troop. This was their bivouac site. This was the warehouse that they were leased and given. And they had set up all their logistical and command vehicles in this area with tents set up here. And by this oil refinery, they put fencing up around it. They put tents here. they had leased this area for use from the refinery, and they also leased these other companies temporary usage of their platforms with the ramps to offload vehicles, as these platforms were used as part of the supply chain when they got supplies by train or cargo containers, and they would offload them with tow motors, or they used their construction equipment at times to get them offloaded and unloaded onto the train through the ramps. And construction equipment was not all that dissimilar from military equipment in terms of weight and other categories. So there were tracked construction equipment like there was tracked military equipment, and it was not all that difficult to unload military equipment from these different platforms, which is where the trains came in and the equipment was offloaded. And it was moved into their bivouac site where tents were set up, concertina wire around their headquarters troop. The other headquarters for the 2nd of the 114th was off map, and one of their batteries was entering the map at the beginning of this battle because there was more PLA troops off map too, because there were 2 full battalions in this area. And there were 2 tank companies, 1 armored infantry company, and 2 platoons from the anti-tank company of just 1 battalion, with another full battalion off map, and the rest of this battalion with its other 2 tank companies, this other armored infantry company, its headquarters and command elements, logistic elements in its headquarters company, and also it had the rest of its anti-tank company with its 2 tank companies and 1 armored infantry company, in addition to the one that was right here, and an additional full battalion off map. And they were already firing their tank guns, or 125 millimeter guns, their 100 millimeter IFV guns and 30 millimeter autocannons, HJ-12E anti-tank missiles. The tanks could also fire ATGMs from their breech, their barrel bore. And these vehicles could, of course, fire their array of missiles and rockets and loitering munitions, and were highly destructive, as well as also their 30 millimeter autocannon and coax machine gun. And all of this fire was let loose, firing through buildings and hitting buildings in some cases. And the Americans fired back and managed to destroy 1 of the PLA tanks of this platoon moving up with this other platoon here. They're moving in a double column formation of vehicles. This tank got hit by a copperhead round, a specialized anti-tank artillery round. This was an artillery round and not an ATGM, essentially, and it got hit and destroyed by the copperhead. And that was unable to be intercepted by its trophy-like system, but it worked and destroyed this tank. But the other ones were firing whatever they had, and they were able to load up quick enough. They put in everything from wrap rounds to regular HE rounds, even a white phosphorus round, and they fired them with PD fuses at these tanks. Some of them missed. They were bore sighting these at this point, and others actually hit, but did nothing to these tanks, and they proceeded on. As all of these forces were moving up in a general flanking maneuver in both areas, with these forces moving up this way, with these forces moving in this way to fire at them from the side. All this movement was very quick. This battle would only last 25 minutes, unlike others that lasted quite a bit longer, because of the addition of the extremely powerful air power dropping lots of ordnance on these forces, the addition of a DF-11A, which caused a massive crater. This could carry quite a warhead in conventional terms. All the loitering munition strikes from 48 CH-901As on AI target-seeking mode with their heat warheads, which are made for heavy armored vehicles, even though the HE would have been enough to destroy one of these Paladins, as their turret could withstand small arms fire, but definitely not HE ammunition from a warhead on a loitering munition crashing down onto it. Strafing attacks from the 23 millimeter nose cannons at these forces here. The Russian Tu-22M begun its bombing run right here and smashed this gun line as the blue crosses over with the red, meaning they're being hit by the ground-based fire, the strafing fire, and the Russian dropped munitions all at the same time. This gun line with the fast Vs and the howitzers, where the troops are running shells and powders back and forth so they keep loading and firing. By the time these forces arrive and they start firing through these buildings at these forces, the air munitions begin to be dropped. The anti-tank vehicles, the QN506s, fire loitering munitions. CH-901A, the big loitering munitions, come in and hit. You've got all this going on. You've got even the armor personnel carriers of the armored infantry firing their 12.7 millimeter machine guns when they have the opportunity. You have the infantry working closely with the armor, as armored infantry is made to do. As they are mutually supporting elements, this squad breaks into two half squads on either side of this tank, and they move up together, and they fire at this half squad of Americans hiding between these chemical plant buildings, these storage tanks in this building right here. And this tank moves up here and they move up here. There's quick exchanges of fire, but when this squad in a line formation moves up here and bounded here, they were exchanging fire here, fire was being exchanged here, and they vectored their fire in an L and annihilated these forces while these forces were moving up here, these two tanks of this tank platoon, with this squad here moving up and peeling around the corner to watch the corner. And these forces were firing, but they would end up being hit by a loitering munition. At the same time, this J-10 fighter came in on a dive attack, dropped its munitions. There's one landing here, one there, one there, one there, one there, one there. All 8 of them, as they were kept on special racks that, as they were free-fall munitions, and they opted to use those instead of laser-guided or Baidu-guided, or essentially Chinese GPS-guided. They used the free-fall and dive attacks because they would get a good spread and destroy all these vehicles with the addition of the loitering munitions. These buildings have red around them. They're completely gutted. This tent's destroyed. This building's gutted. These troops are KIA'd, as well as all the fire being exchanged at this point as this squad peeled around the corner and began laying down fire as the tank proceeded up with them and paused briefly and fired all at the same time as this was going down here, as that was occurring. All of this movement is very fast. These tanks are moving quickly and briefly pausing before continuing to move. As that happens, these two half squads bound and clear this building, while these two half squads who just cleared these buildings move up with this platoon of their vehicles led by their VN-20, with this one moving up led by their VN-20, but they will pause here as the forces of tanks and dismounts begin to clear this area. While they're moving through here with this tank moving up from this tank platoon and this tank moving up, they're firing through these areas as these forces are moving through very early on, and loitering munitions are coming in, including 2 that destroy their recovery vehicle and hit one of their fast Vs and take it out of commission, immediately destroy it. And it needs to be understood that all of these howitzers and fast Vs have turrets for machine guns. They have different crew serve weapons mounted, which include 50 cals and Mark 19s, and even some have 240 Bravos, which are the 7.62 NATO, 7.62 by 51 millimeter. And they're exchanging fire as they're moving up. There's a lot of fire going on. They haven't fired their main howitzer fire yet because they'll have to bore sight that to get a direct fire, as they lack any other type of means for that. While this squad's bounding and using the railroad tracks as cover after they had vectored all their fire at these forces and cleared them, they bound along the tracks, and they're using all their ISR assets to see everything going on. By this point, this place has been carpet munition. This chemical plant's destroyed. This pharmaceutical plant is destroyed. These forces were trying to flee out of the area when this was coming in and destroying this, with the munitions being dropped on it in a dive attack, with the carpet munitioning beginning, just wiping out this gun line, with these forces trying to flee the area, being hit by the Russian munitions and the Chinese munitions landing, as well as loitering munitions coming in. These technicals of armed reactionary civilians trying to flee the area into this area and pass through it, they've been hit and destroyed. That was how they were all told about where the PLA activity was on the map, that they were able to fire over at these forces. They missed again this one because it moved by the time they fired at it, but they also fired at this one. So they have their different firing batteries of both battalions. Combined, the 2 American battalions comprise 6 total firing batteries. Their 2 headquarters batteries, or their headquarters companies essentially, which had their command and control assets right here of their headquarters troop or company of the fire support squadron, and the headquarters of the of the 2nd of the 114th is off map, and one of their batteries is entering the area. As all that's going on, there's so many things on this map occurring all at the same time as all of this movement is going on. this movement over here is going on as well, with one armored infantry company in the area, minus its headquarters and command elements off map, with 2 platoons of vehicles here, and there are other platoon of vehicles right here, but all the dismounted squads are moving up along with the tanks to provide them mutual support, with the 2 platoons out of 4 combat platoons with their headquarters platoon of one of the 2 anti-tank companies of the QN 506s is spread out and sitting back to provide support with their loitering munitions, their S507s, and their dual-purpose anti-tank / anti-air missiles to be able to fire them at any of the armor or the howitzers rather that come into view of these self-propelled howitzers or fast Vs, which again are equipped with turret-based weaponry like crew serve weapons like Mark 19s, 50 cals, and even lighter machine guns like a general-purpose machine gun being a 7.62 NATO, which is a 240 Bravo, or the lighter SAW, which has a high rate of fire, the M249, but it's a 5.56 weapon. But they were moving into this area. They lost a tank to one of the shells that was fired. That was a copperhead, went right into and destroyed this one. But the rest of them continued with an armored recovery force and medics coming in to check this vehicle coming from the headquarters platoon of this company of tanks. While this other platoon on the end, 4 tanks are moving up together to this area, to the tracks, and are laying down heavy fire while these forces tried to fire at them. And while this rolling T formation got to the corner, the fire had hit some of these tanks with HE shells, but it did nothing to the tanks. And as they moved up, they got here, the Americans bounded to the rails and were using that as cover while this squad was moving up along the rails, and they were within grenade range and firing over the rails at each other. They lost 2 soldiers, and the medics had to come and attend to them and pull them out because they were KIA'd, and they also had a wounded soldier, but they had KIA'd these 2 dismounted American gun crews, squads. They were acting as infantry because in Iraq and Afghan, they used artillerymen as infantry because that was their secondary MOS as combat arms. They were trained in infantry tactics, and they were utilized in that way in this battle here. While the other battery with its fast Vs and its headquarters platoon are moving in here, some of the vehicles are moving this way, including these 2 Max Pro MRAPs, to engage these tanks that are now moving over here as the infantry that was right here engaging these forces prepares to move around the area, splitting up into 2 half squads to provide support to the armor, which is now breaking up into its 4 tanks out of the 5, because the 5th tank moves into this area here, and with this squad here that's in a wedge formation to provide mutual support. And by the time the 2 of them get here, they're firing and vectoring fire while these guys moved up here and are vectoring fire. This is all happening quickly, it must be understood. All this movement, again, by the time it's over, it has only lasted 25 minutes. These vehicles and troops are moving relatively quickly together, and they're vectoring their fire in L shapes or X shapes to be able to get the most out of their fires. And again, as troops moved up this way, a half squad and another half squad, they're firing at these forces over here because these forces are moving through the area led by this MRAP and these fast Vs that are part of this battery. They're trying to get behind these buildings where it's a little bit safer while the combat's raging, but they're being fired at by these tanks from across these tracks, or sitting behind these tracks relatively safe, along with this tank moving up here, firing at these forces as they're moving through this area. By this point, the DF-11A has already hit and destroyed and left a massive crater right here and destroyed all these forces in this building. These 8 different 500-pounders have spread out and hit all these forces. The Russian Fab 500s, which were 1,000-pounders being dropped, and they could carry a lot of these. They could carry 53,000 pounds of ordnance. They're being dropped and begun to be dropped right in this area and smashed everything in this area and up, including even these forces as they were moving at the same time through this area. These 2 LMTVs are gone, or this MRAP and LMTV, they're gone. These 2 fast Vs are gone. They're blasted, flipped over, smoked out. These loitering munitions destroyed the armored recovery vehicle and a fast V here. And these tents are all eradicated with all of these troops. And these troops that were trying to flee, these green ones along with this arrow that ends up getting encapsulated in blue with these trucks here, they're all trying to flee this area and get over this bridge. And while there's some over the bridge, which is this arrow right here, as this strategic bomber is carpet munitioning this whole area, destroying the pharmaceutical plant and everyone trying to flee over this bridge, they're all annihilated as this heavy strategic aircraft continues to fly over the area and again hit this whole area of West Houston as retaliation to ensure that the reactionary elements are basically all annihilated. I mean, this city's getting wrecked. As these forces move up to the tracks, this rolling T that had checked this building got to the corner, then got into its wedge formation and bounded here and laid down fire against this squad, and then they bounded here and they were laying down fire against each other while this half squad laid down fire against them, X-shaped, vectored fire. They also fired their HJ-08s at some of these vehicles, rocket-propelled grenades, which were more than enough to destroy a fast V with their type of armor they had. They could withstand small arms, but not rocket-propelled grenade fire. And as that was happening, these forces that were right here, this squad from this other armored infantry platoon, this was a different platoon, these 5 squads moving up here, this squad to support the armor, and these vehicles moving up here, this platoon moved, these 2 vehicles of this single platoon, these 2 APCs moved up here to give their infantry some support, while this VN-20 and 2 APCs behind it of this single platoon of vehicles moved up here and was laying down fire at the same time all of this was going on. Strafing was going on from these fighters all at the same time, strafing these forces here with their 23 millimeter nose cannons right here, as you can see. And as that was happening, as the strafing attack occurred and they flew over quick after strafing this area, this one was strafing forces over in this area here, and they flew over the area quick. I mean, the strafing attack was fast. I mean, they flew over at a high rate of speed, they strafed enemy forces, and then they pulled up. And the other forces that did dive attacks with their munitions did their dive attacks and blasted humongous areas, eliminating virtually this entire firing battery right here. As again, there were 6 firing batteries from the 2 different battalion elements, the Fire Support Squadron of the 278th ACR, and this was its headquarters troop or company. The other headquarters off map was already being decimated by the other forces of the 2 different armored battalions that were attacking. Again, there were only 2 tank companies, 1 armored infantry company, and almost half of a anti-tank company just in this area of one of the 2 battalions. There's the rest of this entire battalion and the whole other battalion off map. And they were finishing off the headquarters and logistical forces of the 2nd of the 114th, while the headquarters and also logistical forces of the regimental fire squadron of the 278th ACR were being destroyed here. And their other batteries were here as well that belonged to the 2nd of the 114th. This was one of their batteries. This was another one that was entering the map here. And they would have vehicles like this field gun peel off that would get destroyed by these tanks as they sat behind the rails. They fired and destroyed these vehicles here and here. And this MRAP would try to get around, but be destroyed as it tried to get around this corner. And these troops of these gun crews would peel off and try to fight, but they would be annihilated by the fire coming from the tanks and the troops that had took position along the rails, and then the tanks coming across along with the troops. Now, they had lost a few troops, and they had a wounded soldier that had to be tended to as well, but they could still put up a fight when they broke into their 2-half squad elements. And the battle would, again, be over extremely quickly. And even though the MRAP and these fast Vs and this other MRAP, they were putting up a fight, they were firing. These loitering munitions, CH-901As, on AI target-seeking mode, they were coming in and hitting and taking out all these vehicles one by one, along with all of the fire coming from the tanks and the armored infantry troops, firing everything from their small arms to their HJ-08 anti-tank weapons to their rocket-propelled grenades, their Chinese Type 69 RPGs, and 35 millimeter grenades, hand grenades. They were also using their heavy machine guns on their APCs and their VN-20 IFVs and their very powerful weapons, and the weapons from the QN-506, along with the Type 99As, of course, the proverbial star of the show. All of these very powerful weapons were highly destructive, as the tanks had very different types of shells. They had Frag T shells, HE shells, heat shells, Sabo ammunition, DU ammunition. They had all types of shells. And the tanks had options when it came to laying down fire on enemy forces. And as they had massive air support from 5 different fighter aircraft in the area, as well as a heavy strategic bomber, and also missile support from a single DF-11A that had been called in through the ISR network and the combat data links showing where everything was in real time, these forces were decimated rapidly. As these forces moved up here and laid down fire on the few survivors still in the area, the tank moved up and took position and used its coax to sweep the area, as well as its turret machine gunner. And as that happened, this squad had finally bounded around here, and early on, this tank had come around the corner and liquidated this half squad right here, while this squad was firing over the rails using it as cover, along with the tank-based fire coming from here. This squad had come around to outflank these forces moving into the area here. They took a little bit of fire quickly here, but it was eventually destroyed from the strafing and the tank-based fire. And then they went around and assisted in destroying what remained of these forces along with the tank-based fire, because they were giving the tanks infantry support when they got around this building here, and they were firing at these forces with the armor also moving up with them as well. And as this tank platoon moved into place here, again, they were firing the whole time while they were on the move, and they took some fire, but it was small arms fire mostly, and some heavy machine gun fire, which again did literally nothing to the tanks. They did lose a few troops in this, because there were a few Americans that got in some licks against the armored infantry dismounts, and they did get one tank with its crew, but that was the limit of their success, because they were picked apart in such a rapid fashion that in 25 minutes, this battle was over, with the combo of air, tactical ballistic missile, and loitering munition support, with all the powerful ground weapons employed from only 3.5 companies attacking 2 battalions of troops. They had annihilated these forces, and the air power and loitering munitions, along with all the potent ground weaponry and the strategic bomber and tactical ballistic missile, made this battle a quick victory. And it was over exceedingly fast. As these forces moved into the area here, at the opening, these technicals had been destroyed as they were spotted with armed reactionary civilians in them. They had been hit by loitering munitions, as normally the PLA would leave civilians alone, unlike the PAP. They would leave them alone if they deemed them not a threat, but if they could see armed reactionary civilians with weapons in hand, to them, they perceived that as a threat, and they dealt with them accordingly. And as these forces moved up here to secure the area, they had finished off what remained of these forces trying to flee into this area, as these 2 tank platoons, as this one had been recovered with the armored recovery vehicle, medics checked for survivors. The rest of these forces had moved into place and had broken up into their 2 platoons. The 4 tanks left from that one and the 5 from this one. And the armored infantry troops bounded across the tracks after eliminating these forces and had basically moved up with the armor, with this squad here and tank, as they moved up together, had moved over the tracks and went to this building here, where the squad would go in the building while the tank stayed outside. And these vehicles had earlier, and troops had vectored their fire, destroyed these forces, and then finished these forces off with the aid of these troops and tanks moving up here before the tanks then crossed and split up with the troops that remained, splitting up. And they had destroyed this battery that was fleeing into the area from the 2nd of the 114th. And by this point, this chemical plant and pharmaceutical plant and the areas adjacent to it, as the first munitions had been dropped, had been totally annihilated as this bomber continued on its path of destruction, with this entire battery hit by a spread of 500-pound munitions, loitering munition strikes, with their heat warheads. This grouping here, including these forces continuing to move into the area, trying to press and attack, were parried and destroyed by these tanks and armored infantry troops, supported by the loitering munitions and anti-tank missiles and laser-guided rockets when they could fire them safely between their forces at these troops. And they were all mauled as they arrived into this area, also by flanking fire, not just from the troops moving up, bounding carefully and getting in the prone, firing over, bounding up, getting over, also laying down fire ahead of them as well before all these forces had been wiped out, because there were a few survivors that it took these troops moving into place to finish off. By the time it was all said and done, this entire area was filled with destroyed field guns and other vehicles. And the PLA had suffered minimal losses as a result, and they had took the field, as the saying goes, and they had completed all their objectives and had smashed 2 of the 3 American artillery battalion-sized elements, with the other one nearly completely destroyed by this point by a Tu-22M strategic bombing raid that occurred in League City, just south of Houston, to the slight south and east, with the remnants that would be mopped up by the full force of the PLAN Marine 1st Brigade upon getting all their heavier elements ashore, including their artillery and their heavier combat battalions. As these forces had finished off the last of these different batteries, with this being a full battery, this being a full firing battery that was busy trying to fire at PLA support troops, along with this battery here firing by the tracks, as they had their troops trying to fan out to protect their battery, who did try to fire back at these approaching PLA troops of the armored infantry and tanks with little success, as the firepower they faced was simply too much, as they got struck from 2 different sides, actually 3, because the fire being vectored on them from the air and ground was of such an intensity that they couldn't withstand it. It was just far too much. From all directions they were hit, from the ground and the air. And as the headquarters and logistical elements of the 2nd of the 114th off the map had been destroyed by the rest of the 2 battalions of the 2 armored battalions, by their 125 millimeter main tank guns, their infantry fighting vehicles, and their weaponry, including their anti-tank missiles, their 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter guns, the 30 autocannon, 100 main gun, the various weaponry on the QN506, it completely devastated these forces. And although counter battery fire could have been done by the immensely massive amounts of artillery of the 83rd PLA Group Army, it was opted to use a combo of air power and the armored forces and maneuver in and destroy these forces, as direct attacks were not the strong suit of artillery forces. They were meant to be a force that would sit from a distance and fire on their enemies and not have to engage them in close-in combat. That was not the strong suit of artillery. So the PLA tactically decided that using maneuver elements to destroy artillery head-on would be a brilliant idea. And for the most part it was, with very minor losses. 2 full battalions of heavy American firepower had now been laid waste to, as this industrial park had a number of its buildings horribly gutted and destroyed, as the refinery had been completely annihilated, the pharmaceutical plant, with other buildings severely damaged or gutted. Although the rail facilities had mostly been captured intact and the PLA would be able to use them themselves in the future, many of these facilities would be thoroughly cleared while looking for surviving enemy forces by the armored infantry, as they would now more methodically, after victory on the battlefield, begin to clear all of these different buildings, with their vehicles waiting outside to support them in case enemies should attempt to flee, as the buildings were being methodically rifled through in the literal and figurative sense, as columns of vehicles along the roads lay in smoking and in some cases burning ruins, with enormous amounts of stored artillery shells simply annihilated by the combo of missile and air strikes and raids going through the area, as already America was facing a shell shortage from having literally pissed away the vast majority of its shells on a proxy conflict in Eastern Europe that it couldn't sustain, and now was in dire short supply of shells and could not afford to lose them in single engagements like what had occurred in a rapid, highly destructive engagement like this, with powerful air strikes and strategic air raids, missile strikes, and very, very powerful maneuver ground units slicing through these forces like a hot knife through butter, with loitering munitions supporting them to boot. It was over for the vast majority of the American heavy guns in this particular battle, minus only several surviving guns and crews that had survived of the first of the 141st in League City to the south and slightly east of Houston, after the Tu-22M had flown over League City and left much of it in ruins, including the unfortunate members of the 1st of the 141st that had been in the path of the strategic air raid that served a dual purpose of destroying certain key sites, as well as also much of the American Artillery Battalion of the 1st of the 141st as well. As now, American options were extremely limited, losing their artillery assets and much of their logistical assets and all of their command and control capabilities and communications. What could they do but try to put up the best fight they could at the most local of levels, as they were rapidly being cut off and annihilated by weaponry of which they had no response for or no defense against, as their naval asset in the form of the Arleigh Burke class destroyer that was off the coast was their only source of air and missile defense, as in protecting them from tactical ballistic missiles and air threats, and it had been jammed by the Kibini systems and sunk by the PLAN and their missiles with their YJ-21, which was a extremely fast-moving anti-ship missile and was likely even hypersonic and could penetrate the Arleigh Burke's defenses with or without the Kibini jamming it. And as the Arleigh Burke had been lost, so too was the American capability to defend its airspace in the local area. As the American Army forces had not deployed any air defense to this area, most of their air defense was located on the 3 key installations in the South Central Invasion sector, which had consisted primarily of the Fort Hood installation, Fort Sill, and the Fort Bliss installation, all of which, having been thoroughly destroyed in very powerful SEAD operations, or suppression of enemy air defense operations, whereby the coalition had gone in there and struck by air and missile and artillery any American air defense assets that could be seen. And in fourth generation warfare, with the Trojan shock forces blended together with the external components moving inland from outside the nation as heavy-handed reinforcements, the Trojans were the star of the show. And they had stored their assets and logistics all throughout the nation, and their artillery was nearly ubiquitous and could fire on almost everything inside the land, especially with systems like the A300 and even the PHL-03, which had its 80-mile range, while the A300 had a 187-mile range and was the longest range and most destructive artillery system in the world. And that equipped the PLA active duty artillery battalions when it came to their 300mm rocket battalions, with their tanks in a league of their own just based off of their specifications alone, as well as also their newest weapons, of which they were churning out designs at a rate never before seen when it came to new generations of weapons that many other nations simply didn't possess, with Russia being their closest competitor in terms of new vehicle and weapon platform designs. And these were proliferating fast because China had the capability to mass produce vehicles and weapons at a rate never before imaginable. They had more weapons already in terms of an aggregate of stored and active weapons than any other nation on Earth, as in stored for their paramilitary and reserve forces and long-term storage combined with their active weapons. As their forces triumphed on the field of battle, and this battle lasted only 25 minutes, other battles were still raging at the same time, as this battle had come to its end before 1:30, as the PAP by this time was still fighting the 3rd Squadron, and the fighting in the east of Houston was hitting a fever pitch. And although the combat had wrapped up where the nucleus, the nerve center of the city's defenses at Ellington, had been thoroughly smashed by 1 a.m., the battle would continue for some hours, and more combat was occurring, including the battle with other 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade battalions, with 2 of its mechanized infantry battalions attacking the 2nd Squadron, as well as its combat engineers seamlessly seizing the Houston Southwest Airport without a fight, as their mechanized infantry had handled the local threat of the 2nd Squadron, which will be gone over in the next installation of the hypothetical invasion documentary series of America, utilizing 4th generation warfare doctrines and real world everything.